Hey everyone, have you ever had a bromance before? If you haven't and or don't know what the definition of that means, you probably want to explore the relationship between the Cincinnati Bengals and the Buffalo Bills. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about a lot more on this week's episode of the Orange and Black Insider Bengals podcast. Great to have everyone with us here. I know there's quite a few of you who are joining us live, and thank you so much for doing so. I'm Anthony Cosenza. This is the Orange and Black Insider Bengals podcast. It is live, courtesy of YouTube and CincyJungle.com. And you can also get the podcast in case you are new to the program or cannot join us live, usually on Wednesday nights. You can get us on iTunes, SoundCloud, YouTube, CincyJungle.com, and you can also get in touch with the show on Twitter at BengalsOBI and via email, theobinsider@gmail.com. A lot to talk about tonight, Bengals fans. I'm hoping to be joined by my usual co-host, Scott Schultze, in the near future here, but a lot to talk about, and most of it is positive. Some of it is negative, and some of it is a little bit of the I don't know what to make of it kind of category, I guess. I'm not totally sure where to start because I guess I'll start here. Okay. The Cincinnati Bengals are usually, at least in recent memory, have not been big players in free agency over the past handful of years. Now, some of their big headlines have been in re-signing major players that they've already had for a while, and they re-sign them to, big contracts and whatnot. But really, over the past couple of years, it's been more of who they've lost. Marvin Jones, Mohamed Sanu, Andrew Whitworth, Kevin Zeitler. I mean, the list is pretty extensive. And this year, we talked about it last week a little bit, so I'm not going to rehash a ton of it, but the Bengals swung a trade for offensive tackle Cordy Glenn, and he appears to be a guy that they are going to rely on in 2018 to anchor the left tackle spot, and rightfully so. A good player when healthy, and I think even though the money is a bit high, that's an upgrade based on what we've seen from Jake Fisher and Cedric Ogbuehi. The Bengals also, before even the Cordy Glenn trade, they signed Chris Baker, defensive tackle, a guy who at a minimum will be a rotational piece in the Bengals defense and will hopefully help their run defense and continue to get to the quarterback. Hopefully the Bengals get somewhere, even if they get something in between what Baker showed with the Buccaneers last year and a string of 3 or 4 years with the Washington Redskins where he was a borderline Pro Bowler. If he's somewhere in between there, I think the Bengals got a very good deal there. Since the Bengals have re-signed punter, punters are people too, guys. Punter Kevin Huber, they re-signed Tyler Eifert, and they've added a couple of other outside guys to their team, and it seems as if they're doing things and spending some money that they needed to spend in order to improve their football team. And these aren't the guys they signed, aside from maybe Eifert, obviously when healthy is a top 5 tight end. When and if healthy is the key words there, but there are other contracts they've given out that could be they're not the flashy, the sexy, the big time headlines that go in NFL free agency, but they are needed signings. So we're going to talk about that tonight. I guess where we're going to start, we're going to talk tonight about additions, but we're also going to talk about perhaps addition by subtraction. And a lot of folks have who have been following the Bengals have been have a few players in mind when it comes to that, in terms of what the Bengals have done or not done this offseason. Let's start with Preston Brown, though, because based on what we talked about last episode, we already talked about Cordy Glenn. We talked about a number of different issues, but Preston Brown is the guy who essentially led the league in tackles last year, and he's a guy who, doesn't jump off doesn't jump off on a film type of perspective. If you watch film, if you watch him, he's not a guy who makes the wow plays. And on one hand, you kind of wish that the Bengals had signed a guy like that, because it's the wow plays, it's the impact plays that maybe would have taken them from a 6-7 win team to a 9-7 team, a 10-6 team on, especially on defense. Now, Preston Brown is a guy who I thought going into this offseason was a guy that the Bengals should target. And I say that not because he's, a guy who's going to make splash headlines or what have you, but he's a guy who can come into a defense, he tackles well, and he kind of just puts his head down and works. Is he spectacular? No. Is he a guy that could improve a defense that ranked 30th against the run? Absolutely. And I think that's where the Bengals are probably at this point. And I don't want to sit here and say, this Preston Brown is going to change the team. It's going to, he's a guy who's going to give them a couple more wins a year, but it's kind of a piece of the puzzle. And the Bengals thought that they maybe had something like that in Kevin Minter last year. Probably, in terms of amount of snaps and all that, you're probably going to see a lack of that from Preston Brown. But I do think that Preston Brown, given his history with the Bills and his playing numerous spots in the Buffalo defense, I do think that he probably has more snaps in him, and he's younger. It has more snaps in him than Kevin Minter did with the Bengals last year. There are obvious issues with the Bengals covering tight ends, covering slot receivers, and all of that. And obviously there are players who, whether it's the draft or what have you, there are players who could fill those holes. But I do think Preston Brown fills a major need for the Bengals. And if you know anything about the Bengals and have followed them over the past couple of years, you would know that in free agency, they get guys that are either fringe starters or guys who are contributors, so that they go into the draft without any incredibly glaring needs. Now, we're going to talk about something else in a minute, and another position that could be addressed in that regard. But I think Preston Brown makes sense on a lot of levels. And run defense being the paramount importance. Run defense, you have in the AFC North, whether it's Le'Veon Bell or whoever else, you need to be able to stop the run, and you need to be able to make teams one-dimensional. And give the Bengals credit a bit on this front. The Bengals have been a bit one-dimensional because they have not been able to run the football for a variety of reasons over the past couple of seasons, and it's reflected in their record. I mean, they've invested high picks in Giovanni Bernard, Jeremy Hill, and Joe Mixon, but they've let certain offensive linemen go, and because of that, they have not been able to run the ball effectively, especially against the AFC North foes, which this is kind of a controlling the clock type of division. This is kind of a, you get a lead and maybe you sit on it a little bit. I mean, you do want to go for the throat a bit, but if you get a lead in the AFC North, you run the ball, and if you're able to do so effectively, that's a really good pathway to getting a division crown. And the Bengals, while they have invested in flash of late, they have not found some answers at linebacker. And hopefully Preston Brown, even though it's a one-year deal, it is team friendly and it is potentially lucrative to Brown, but this is a signing that I think that the Bengals needed. And, a lot of people have thought that Tahir Whitehead was a guy that, made a lot of sense because of his versatility and his familiarity with Terrell Austin's defensive scheme with the Lions. But, this just makes a lot of sense. And Preston Brown is a guy, he's probably not going to do. Honestly, to me, he's a guy who is maybe, I don't mean this both as a slight to one player and a a slight to another, but he's maybe a guy who is a more talented and as versatile as Vincent Ray. He can play a number of positions and just does what is asked of him. Vincent Ray is a guy that you love, and I've said this numerous times as a former coach. Vincent Ray is a guy that you love to have on your team from a number of different aspects, but he lacks the big plays, and there are times where you go, you miss that one there, buddy. And I don't think that you're going to see the latter part, you missed that one there, Preston. I don't think you're going to see that, but I don't also think that I don't think we'll be seeing the wow, the pick sixes, the game sealing pass defense, whatever the case may be. I think you're going to be seeing someone that goes in there, does the tough work, does the dirty work, if you will, and helps the defense. Now, if you watch the Bengals really over the past two seasons when they've only had a combined 13 wins, you're going to notice a really, really obvious absence of tackling. And when you add a Preston Brown, that is a guy who that's his forte. And, like I said, whether it's against the run or what have you, I just think that it's a good piece to have. Now, some folks, the cynics, may say, oh, he's just a slight upgrade over Kevin Minter, who had a very subpar season with the Bengals last year at the middle linebacker spot and really had minimal snaps. I mean, he just, based on his skill set and what the Bengals like to do on defense, he just didn't really have a place on the Bengals defense for, being a 3-down guy. Now, I don't think Preston Brown is a 3-down guy. I think at a minimum, though, he is a 2-down guy, a guy who can move around and do some things. I don't think he's a great coverage linebacker, which obviously that is still a weakness of this Bengals defense. But I think he is a guy who is smart, a guy who is very he's a sound tackler, and a guy that I think could upgrade the Bengals day one on this defense. And I think that, even though it's a one-year deal, I think that, it's something that the Bengals are looking at as a potential long-term solution. He's in his mid-20s. And, of course, the Bengals have a lot of fluidity at linebacker. And that has something to do with young guys they have on the roster, other guys that are potential stars and they can't count on. But it is what it is, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. But the Bengals signed Preston Brown to a one-year deal. I think it's a solid move by the team. I think that Cincinnati is a better football team with Preston Brown on this team as of, as we sit here in late March, and things could change, obviously, with the draft in 2018, and that happens next month. There is still talk of, them potentially taking a linebacker in the high rounds. I definitely think that's a possibility. We're going to talk a little bit more about that as the program goes on, but I think that Preston Brown is a solid addition. All of a sudden, okay, so you look at it and you go, okay, obviously the offense was an issue last year. Okay. Eifert was out. John Ross was a non-factor for a variety of reasons. And the offensive line was a mess. You bring in Cordy Glenn to help that offensive line. John Ross is supposedly healthy and ready to go. You re-sign Tyler Eifert. You have A.J. Green. You have Tyler Boyd. You have Brandon LaFell. You have Josh Malone. You have all of these weapons. And all of a sudden, well, maybe we can do some things that we weren't able to do last year. And I'm not saying that Glenn and Brown and all of these are what has ailed the Bengals over the past couple of years, but I think that they are making moves to remedy quite a bit of issues. And what's great is, when you looked at the Kevin Minter signing last year, this was a signing that was made, far into free agency. This is now a bit more of an aggression, a bit more of an aggressive side that we've seen from the Bengals that we have not seen over the past couple of years. And I think their team is better for it. They're not, paying the ridiculous contracts to top tier guys necessarily, but they are guys who are starters and or guys who can come in and rotate and play well. And I think Preston Brown can do that. I really think so. Down, 2 downs, what have you. I think that he is a valued addition to the Bengals. Now, I want to say this, I don't want to pump up the Preston Brown thing too much, but I do think he's a good addition. There is a weird relationship going on with the Bills and the Bengals. Now, if you remember back in 2010, 2011, 2012, the Bengals and the 49ers had a very weird relationship in a similar vein where they signed each other's players. They went after the same free agents, all of that. And you look at also the relationship between the Patriots and the Bengals. There's a lot of swapping of players and trades and all of that as well. I don't know quite what to make of it, other than, what? These are teams that either run similar schemes, like similar players, and or just have a great working relationship and make these moves happen. And you can say for better, for worse, if you look at the history between the Bengals and the 49ers, the Bills and the Patriots over the last handful of years, there's a lot of weird similarities. But hey, you know what? These are teams if we're talking about the 49ers and the Patriots specifically, those are teams that are very successful, and they they know what they want out of players. They get what they want out of players, and they fit a particular scheme. Maybe the Bengals kind of know what they're doing in the same vein. Maybe they get guys who have, maybe they were targets of one of those teams, and then they didn't get them in the draft, and now, they maybe didn't fizzle with another team, and the Bengals got their hands on them. But, there's a relationship, to be sure, between the Bills and the Bengals, and that's not a bad thing. Is it weird? Yeah. You can say, bromance and all that stuff, but it's okay. And the good thing is the Bengals are bringing in guys not only that can help their team, but guys who have been on successful teams of late. The Bills went to the playoffs last year. The 49ers in the early 2010s went to the NFC Championship and Super Bowl. The Patriots are always in that dance. So, they get guys who are acclimated to a winning culture, and they have brought them into their locker room, and I don't see a problem with that. Now, it's a matter of playing them. It's a matter of getting them in the right position to be successful. That's where the Bengals maybe have fallen short in comparison to other clubs. But, there's definitely a relationship between Buffalo and Cincinnati. You can kind of laugh about the Andy Dalton touchdown against the Ravens in Week 17 that got the Bills into the playoffs. And that's okay, but, I mean, these are teams that know each other well. These are teams that have probably targeted the same players. Preston Brown, for instance, is a guy from, I believe he's from Louisville, and a guy from, who the Bengals have kept an eye on. And all of a sudden he fell into their lap, and he's now, as we sit here today, their starting linebacker. Now, you have to kind of look at a couple of different things from this standpoint. And one thing I think is particularly interesting is the fact that free agency has become very different in terms of the NFL landscape. And one of the things that I find particularly interesting is the fact that veterans, guys who there was I believe it was through the SB Nation website, I think it was in like January or February, and it was predicting a contract for Preston Brown. And it was like a 4-year or 3-year, $30-some million contract. And wow, I mean, you sit here and you go, okay, well, if he's maybe a top 15 middle linebacker, he's going to be paid X amount of money. Well, because of the CBA, because of the NFL landscape being what it is, I mean, teams are just not paying big money to the veterans out there. And they're not paying – they are paying money to them, but if you notice, there's a lot of one-year kind of rental deals that teams are paying out, and that's kind of what the Bengals did with Preston Brown. It's what they did with Tyler Eifert, and it's what the Eagles did a lot of in terms of how they built their team in 2017. They paid a lot of one-year deals, trades, all that kind of stuff, short-term kind of deals to build their team. Now, there are pros and cons to that, but who knows? Maybe Preston Brown is a valuable member of this defense, and in mid-year the Bengals say, hey, let's extend you. Let's give you a couple more years. You work well in our system. But if he doesn't, it's kind of the Kevin Minter deal. And he may be shown the door. By the way, Kevin Minter is also flirting with the Bills to further this bromance. He is flirting with the Bills in terms of getting a deal there. So, I think Preston Brown is a valuable asset. Is he the cure-all to everything? Absolutely not. But you throw in a Chris Baker, you throw in a Preston Brown, you now move William Jackson, it seems, into a starting spot, and all of a sudden maybe this defense is improved from where it was over the past couple of years. And I don't see the downside. I really don't. Preston Brown is now a Bengal. He's probably going to play middle linebacker, and there are a lot of things going on with the linebacker position. This is the Orange and Black Insider Bengals podcast. I'm Anthony Cosenza. I hope to be joined by my co-host Scott Schultze in the near future. If not, then you got me for the night, and I apologize for that. But I hope you felt as excited with the Brown signing as I did, because it just seemed to be a needed signing. Defensive tackle opposite of Geno Atkins, and obviously middle linebacker seemed to be a spots that the Bengals needed to address. And granted, they could do so in the draft, and they still might, but it just seems that those are veteran guys they can rely on going forward. Speaking of linebacker positions, after all of the slew of good news in terms of signings and bolstering the roster and all of that, news that Vontaze Burfict might be succumbing to a 4-game suspension. He's not the middle linebacker. He kind of slid into that role in certain packages last year, but he's not the team's middle linebacker. But obviously, when the team has both Geno Atkins and Vontaze Burfict, this is a very different defense that they field. And whether it's attitude, whether it's nastiness, whatever you want to point to, I wrote a post on cincyjungle.com where 12 of 2013 was on the field. They were easily in the top 10 in overall defense. And when he was not on the field in terms of all 16 games or playoffs or what have you, they never finished above 11th. Now, obviously, top 10, 11, that's not a big discrepancy, but there is a noticeable difference, and I don't think many people can dispute that. I don't know where the Bengals go. Burfict in terms of his appeal. Now, he could appeal this, and all of a sudden this thing turns into a 2-game suspension. But Burfict has fair or not, has kind of cemented a reputation as being an unreliable player. And I think it's basically been from 2015 on that the Bengals have essentially started the year without Vontaze Burfict on the field. Injury or recovering from that, whether it's suspensions, what have you. He is just not a reliable player. And I love the guy. I love his attitude. And I think that, most people who hate on him in terms of other fan bases, I think if he was on their team, he's a guy that you just really go to bat for. But I also think that the Bengals are essentially play with a handicap every year when it comes to Vontaze Burfict. Now, how do you approach this? Do you approach it as, okay, we have a Pro Bowl linebacker, he's there, he's on our roster, but we don't know how many games he's going to play a year, so let's do whatever we're going to do regardless? Or do you kind of say, we don't have this guy, so we have to have immediate impact players now, potentially in his spot, so that, the Bengals are able to, at a minimum, tread water. I don't know if I know the answer to that. I think at this point it's almost kind of akin to the John Ross situation where, hey, in terms of approaching the draft, in terms of, hey, we didn't have this guy last year. If we get him, it's an added bonus. Let's get the best guy available, and even if that guy's a wide receiver, a linebacker, what have you, I don't know. And I've defended Burfict. I've also been a critic of him. I don't know what the Bengals should do here. And quite frankly, I think that's the mindset of the front office. I think that they sit there and they go, this is a guy who went on the field as a top 5 linebacker in the NFL. But when on the field, quote unquote, is term there. And he's reckless with his tackling, causing injuries. He has, for right or wrong, been a target for penalties and is now a target by the NFL in terms of questionable hitting. And now you're faced with missing him another 4 games to start the 2018 season. I think that this obviously points to the intelligence in signing Preston Brown, if you want to point to a positive. But I also think that probably have a lot to sort out here in terms of his future, in terms of what he can, and maybe his future with the club is more about what happens if he loses his appeal, if he gets the entire 4-game suspension, that sort of thing. But I just, yeah, it's really, really strange. The Marvin Lewis and the Bengals really seem to value availability. They really seem to value reliability in terms of suiting up and playing on Sundays. Yet, some of those guys that they love reliability front are not the best players at their respective position. And yet, they still favor Burfict in light of all of these issues. At this point, you kind of shrug your shoulders and say, well, that's just what comes with this guy? Or do you say, in an offseason, not full of change, but in some ways there's a lot of change being shown? Do you say, is this the guy we want to continue to hang our hat on in 2018, especially as Marvin Lewis signed a 2-year extension, obviously a short-term deal to try and get the team back to the playoffs and through the playoffs. Obviously, they're doing more moves that helps the team immediately, as evidenced by this free agency period. Do you sit here and you say, maybe we cut bait? Maybe this guy is just simply not worth it? Or do you say, what, this is a guy who went a player, there's no doubt about it, is an enforcer, is a guy who strikes fear in opposing offenses for the right or wrong reasons. I mean, you can debate that, but this is a very tenuous situation with the Bengals, and I think that they might let the appeal and all of those processes kind of play out before they make a final decision. But as of now, Vontaze Burfict is Bengal, and as of now, and if those of you who are tuning into this program are not aware, his suspension is based around a violation of the PED area in terms of league violations. He claims that it was based on medications he took for his concussion and all of that. You can point fingers all you want at that, and there are a lot of fingers to be pointed at medical staffs, doctors, Burfict himself, all of that, whatever. I'm not going to go into that, but I mean, at some point, if you pay a guy solid money, which the Bengals did, I think it was a 3-year, $38 million contract to Burfict last offseason. He forfeits a lot of the guarantees in that contract if he suffers the entirety of this 4-game suspension. But at some point, you kind of got to look at it and say, what's the cost? What's the risk benefit type of thing here? And I think that most every Bengals fan would say you got to have him on the field. It just kind of comes with what having Burfict on your roster. That's kind of the cost of it. But I don't know. I just you see all of these nice moves the Bengals make: Preston Brown, Matt Barkley, Tyler Eifert, all things that bolster their roster, and then all of a sudden you go, oh my gosh, it's 2 steps forward, 4 steps back, and you would hate to just lose them in terms of cutting, waiving, whatever that process is, and then he goes somewhere else and he's uber productive. But at the same time, how many chances can a guy get? And, we've talked about that with Adam Jones. We've talked about that with other guys that have been on the Bengals team. And, that's a question only the Bengals brain trust can answer at this point. And even though they brought in Preston Brown, a guy who can play potentially any other and has played other linebacker spot defenses and a nice Band-Aid of sorts, whether Burfict is gone or not, I thought about Brown flanked with Burfict, maybe you have Vigil and you have Evans and maybe a draft pick that kind of mixes in there, and all of a sudden you've got a really formidable linebacker core, and all of a sudden now, for the first month, Burfict is gone, and it's a shame. It's a shame, and we'll see what happens, but definitely something to be aware of. Michael Myers says, I'm not too sure other teams want to deal with him, meaning Burfict. Seems like a lot of teams are staying from layers. Now that Burfict has taken his dumbness from the field to off the field, I'm done, says Brent Stoll. I don't disagree with any of those stances. I really don't. I'm kind of, I guess, a fence rider in this Burfict and all of that. The Bengals could save a decent amount of money. The problem is now, though, is because it's in the middle of free agency, if you could potentially save a decent amount of money by cutting him, a lot of the bigger name guys are off the market. So you cut him, you have this money, and where do you put it? I don't know. But, I think that Burfict is a guy that embodies AFC North defensive football. Nasty, mean, tackler, big playability. If you ask any Steelers fan, they absolutely hate him. But had he been on their team, they would defend him to, the very end. And a guy that I think the Bengals defense want to embody things that Burfict brings, but he's just an unreliable player, and it's a very difficult decision. And unfortunately, it's been kind of a bit of bad news amongst a number of tidbits that have been, good news, I guess, for the Bengals this offseason and in free agency. So, Burfict is for now suspended for the first 4 games of the season. Preston Brown is in the fold at linebacker. So there's, perhaps the Bengals maybe knew some of these issues. The Brown signing, we'll see. This is the Orange and Black Insider Bengals podcast. I'm Anthony Cosenza, and we're talking free agency. We're talking Bengals. I don't mean to be negative Nancy about this thing because there's a lot to like about what the Bengals have done this spring, but there are some bits of reality to deal with. Aside from linebacker, one of the things, and we have beaten this poor dead horse, I don't know how many times on the program, but now we can definitively say that Tyler Eifert is with the Bengals, and he is the go-to tight end for the Bengals in 2018, and is, by all indications, pretty much healthy. You can knock on wood, you can knock on whatever it is that you do for superstitious purposes. But Tyler Eifert is a Bengal in 2018, and I thought that the good route for the Bengals to take in 2018 was to franchise tag Tyler Eifert, and that would be about a $9.5 million hit. He would be guaranteed all that money, and that's a guarantee type of contract. Well, turns out he signed a 1-year deal, like a franchise contract, and it's essentially for about $8.5 million if he plays games, hits incentives, all that stuff. And the cap hit for the Bengals is about $4.5 million. So all of a sudden, the Bengals got a franchise tag type of player in Tyler Eifert for much less money. And this is why I'm not in a front office. This is why No offense to any of you who are listening. This is why none of you are in a front office, because they felt that they could get the guy on a similar type of deal with less guaranteed money and less out of pocket expense. And like Burfict, Eifert has been a guy. He is a very frustrating player in a different way. Burfict is a frustrating play, obviously, because of penalties and suspensions and all of that. Eifert doesn't dabble in that area, but he does dabble in the injury area like Burfict does. And I just think that this is a very, very wise move for the Bengals, especially in terms of their short-term goals, especially in terms of, hey, the draft, we value our high picks, and we're gonna continue to pay you. I think that both Eifert and the Bengals really, it's a good fit. I think Eifert likes being on the Bengals. I think he knows that when he's healthy, he's incredibly productive when he's with the Bengals. So it's kind of like hey, why not? And we talked about it last week, and unfortunately, about a day or two after we aired the episode, this news on Eifert came out. But the market was very quiet with Tyler Eifert, and maybe that was because he was only talking to the Bengals. We've since found out that he was chatting with the Rams and the Niners, and the Bengals came and said, hey, here's a 1-year deal. We'll give you a little more guaranteed money and stick with us. And he did. I think now that this offense is much better with Tyler Eifert. Slight to CJ Uzomah. That's not a slight to Tyler Kroft. It's just a fact that when the Bengals are in the red zone and Tyler Eifert is out there and healthy, Tyler Eifert produces in the red zone. And, the Bengals struggled to put up points, especially in 2016, a little bit in 2017. And I think his absence last year really affected that. And all of a sudden now, Eifert's back in the fold. You have Joe Mixon, you have Giovanni Bernard, and you've got a supposedly improved offensive line with Cordy Glenn. But who knows? This could be very beneficial to. And based on his social media, Tyler Eifert wanted to be with the Bengals, and if he produces and the Bengals offer him a lucrative contract, he will probably stay a Bengal after 2018, if he lives up. The Bengals are pretty good about extending their core players, and Eifert is a core player, but he just hasn't stayed healthy, hence the 1-year deal. And who knows? He is plays 12 games and has 10 touchdowns, and all of a sudden the Bengals are saying, hey, this is a guy we just need. And the tight end market, if you looked at what some of the tight ends got in free agency, this is a pretty good deal for the Bengals. And you know what? I don't want to say, Eifert is dumb for taking this deal, because he's not. But I kind of think that this, based on the free agency market that we've seen, the 1-year kind of rental deal is kind of what he was going to expect to get. I think that he's comfortable here in Cincinnati. I think that he is a producer when healthy, and I think that there's probably something on the table where the Bengals said, hey, if you take this, you sign it, and you produce, and you play, and all of that, we will continue to pay you in terms of another contract, maybe something a little bit more long-term and guaranteed. But I think the Bengals, in terms of the offense, are better now that Tyler Eifert is in the fold. I see Will Smith here in the YouTube chat says Kroft was one of the few bright spots last year. The tight end position is set. I agree. It's so funny because a lot of folks would say, oh my gosh, there's so much risk in paying Eifert a decent amount of money and bringing him back and all of that. I think there was just amount of risk, just as high of an amount of risk in terms of relying on Croft, Uzoma, Mason Schreck, a guy who was on IR, a rookie last year, and maybe even another tight end this year who may or may not play. I think there was as big of a risk in that front. So now all of a sudden you can do. I think last week we had a number of listener questions, and one of which was, "Hey, what about 2 tight end sets and all of that?" And I think now you can use that more effectively, especially with Croft showing the fact that he can do things in the red zone in the short areas. He had 7 touchdowns last year. All of a sudden now you have Croft, you have Eifert, you have AJ Green, you have Tyler Boyd, you have John Ross, you have Brandon LaFell, you have all these guys on the field, and Andy Dalton can use a number of security blankets. And I think that is that's invaluable. And I think Tyler Eifert is a guy that Andy Dalton could and will use in 2018. And I think that, call me overly optimistic, but I think Tyler Eifert is going to be a guy that the Bengals offense will be very happy about his return this year. And again, it's all about him being healthy. It's all about him be on the field. But I just think that when he's on the field, this is a different offense. And it's not just him. Okay, I mean, he's a great player. He's a first-round talent, Pro Bowl player, obviously. But it's not just him. It's kind of like the Preston Brown thing at linebacker on DB. It's kind of a cog in a wheel that needs to be in place, And when you look at 2015, when Marvin Jones came back, Mohamed Sanu was there. Giovanni Bernard was back. There was a lot of injuries that happened in 2014 and a lot of weapons that were not in place for Andy Dalton. Andy Dalton's stats, if you look at his stats between 2014 and 2015, there is a major disparity because he had so many more weapons back in 2015. And I think Eifert obviously is one of the you look at his numbers haven't been horrible the last couple of years. The problem is just the offense and the team in general has kind of been blah. And unfortunately last year, really the last 2 years, I mean, I think Eifert really, if I remember correctly, has missed about 24 games over the last 2 years. So, I just if the team's philosophy, which it appears to be, is to surround Andy Dalton, is to commit to Andy Dalton as their quarterback, then they need to surround him with all kinds of talent around him. Andy Dalton is an above-average quarterback, but we all know that he is a guy that needs a ton of talent around him to look like an MVP. And now, like I said, of all the names mentioned and Eifert back in the fold, I think that potentially propels him back into that category. I'm Anthony Cosenza. This is the Orange and Black Insider Bengals podcast. Thanks so much to all of you joining us live. Thanks to all of you who have downloaded the program. Since there's a lot to be positive about with the Cincinnati Bengals right now, but more has to play out, and obviously on-field production has to also show that these moves have paid off. You can get this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, YouTube, and CincyJungle.com. You can also get in touch with us at BengalsOBI on Twitter and the OBInsider@gmail.com via email. Speaking of quarterbacks, we've talked about Andy Dalton and his need to that. The Bengals signed a backup quarterback. Last week, I think, right as we hit the air, A.J. McCarron was off to the Bills and probably is there, at least for the time being, starting quarterback. And the Bengals signed Matt Barkley, a guy who was he's had an interesting career, to say the least. Had he come out in 2012 he probably would have been a top 5 pick. He came out in 2013 and ended up going, I believe, at the top of the 4th round to the Philadelphia Eagles. Given his production in the pros and given all kinds of things, you can sit here and say, okay, well, that was the right call. But still, a very productive player in a pro system in college, and a guy that seems to be a good locker room character, that sort of thing. And now he is entering a system under Bill Lazor in which he was drafted in. Bill Lazor was with Philadelphia when the team selected him a few years back. So, Matt Barkley, just, kind of a not even a has-been, but maybe a never was, but he is familiar with this system. He is a guy with a similar skill set to Andy Dalton. This team has committed to Andy Dalton. There's, barring something unforeseen in the draft, I don't see them taking a quarterback high. So maybe, Matt Barkley is the guy that they rely on going forward in 2018 as a backup quarterback. You also have to look at it. Jeff Driscoll, a guy that the team broke his arm in a practice late in the year, and he is a project player. So now they need a guy, potentially, if Andy goes down, can come in, carry the team for a game or two, carry the offense, is familiar with the offense, and can do some of the things that Andy Dalton did. And I think that the thought process with Matt Barkley is that, yes, he can do. Is he going to light the world on fire? No. But like with Andy Dalton, if he's surrounded by an immense amount of talent, he'll probably do quite a few things. And I think now that's where this decision makes sense. And, I see Christopher Higdon here. And by the way, Christopher Higdon and I are on the same wavelength here, because in an early mock draft I had for the Bengals on CincyJungle.com, I had Luke Falk, the Washington State quarterback, being a mid-round pick. I don't think that this precludes the Bengals from taking a quarterback in the draft. I don't. I really don't. And they may very well do that. They may. It probably depends on who's there, and all of that kind of. Washington State, I actually think he is essentially a taller Andy Dalton clone, and I think he'd be a good fit too. But that being said, the Bengals have Matt Barkley, and they added him on a 2-year deal, relatively affordable, all of that good stuff. And I think that you can sit here and say, well, maybe that's a straight swap from AJ McCarron to Matt Barkley. That's fine, but and you're going to sense a theme here. What the Bengals are doing is they are essentially entering the draft, whether it's the Preston Brown signing, the Cordy Glenn trade, Eifert, Huber, all that. They are entering the draft with guys that they have in place and may have possible improvements. Now, there are easy criticisms to be had about that, because then you go, okay, well, you have the roster filled out, you draft these guys, and then you don't play them. Obviously, that happens. But I just kind of feel like the Barkley thing continues to open the draft up for the Bengals, and I think that it's something that makes sense on a number of levels. And maybe they draft another quarterback and a guy, but this is a guy, again, this fortunately and unfortunately, kind of a little short-sighted at this point right now. And it's evidenced by Marvin Lewis's 2-year contract. It's evidenced by their faith currently in Andy Dalton. It's evidenced in a lot of different players. But I just kind of think if you're going to play into that mindset and that I think that is the Barkley signing makes sense from that standpoint, and I think that I don't know that Barkley will come in and lead the Bengals to a playoff win or anything like that, but I do think that if God forbid Andy Dalton gets hurt, that is a guy who can carry the torch, knows laser system, and can help the Bengals at least in the immediate future. But we'll see. We'll see. This is the Orange or Black Insider Bengals podcast. I'm Anthony Cosenza, and you can get this program on SoundCloud, YouTube, iTunes, CincyJungle.com, and you can get in touch with the program at Bengals OBI on Twitter and the OB Insider at Gmail. I guess where we need to go now is a little bit of addition by subtraction. And last week, Scott Schultze and I talked about how Adam Jones was kind of, it's a little unfair, but he was a little bit of that ilk. Potentially Vontaze Burfict is of that ilk. And if the Bengals choose to part ways with him. Now, the bromance continues with the Bills and the Bengals. The Bills have signed Russell Bodine to a 2-year deal to be their center. And it's about at a $5 million per year type of deal. Now, this is if the Bengals have or were in the runnings for his services, and given some sources, it sounds like they had offered a longer-term deal, less guaranteed money, that sort of thing, again, to Bodine to stick with Cincinnati, and he didn't. It's almost, and now here's the thing, though, because I talked about this a second ago. The Bengals do not like to enter the draft, at least under Marvin Lewis. They do not like to enter the draft with an insane, glaring hole on their roster. And that's evidenced by their drafting of multiple cornerbacks in the first round. The list goes on and on. They drafted Tyler Eifert just a few years after they drafted Jermaine Gresham in the first round. So, they kind of like to do the best player available that also kind of fits a need. Now, all of a sudden, they don't have a starting center. And we can sit here and squat on Russell Bodine all we want and his lack of performance with the Bengals, and there is a lot of evidence to point to that. But the Bengals do not have a center as of this point right now. And one of the Pouncey brothers just signed, I believe, with the Rams. So if anyone is wondering about his availability and his possibility with landing with the Bengals, that's not going to happen. And nor was it going to happen that the Bengals were going to pay a free agent center a lot of money. It's just not in their cards. And if you know anything about the Bengals, granted the aforementioned tight end picks in the first round, but they do not traditionally value interior offensive linemen, tight ends, safeties. It's just not who they are. And it would appear, now I think personally that the Bengals will probably get a agent center, or maybe internally they're saying, hey, Christian Westerman or Alex Redmond, or these are TJ Johnson. These are guys that we can at least, worst comes to worst, we can rely on these guys. But I don't believe that's the case, and I don't believe that the Bengals. I think that probably, and I've said this before in this program, I think that this draft will probably be a non-sexy one in terms of positions they draft and who they get and all of that. And that's okay, because last year, they drafted 2 wide receivers in the first 4 rounds, a running back in the second round. They kind of went sexy last year. I kind of think this is going to be kind of the interior of the team, the big guys, all that kind of thing. And there are a lot of the good news for the Bengals. There are a lot of interior offensive linemen who can probably come in day one and help their team. Now, I'm not going to bash Russell Bodine. I mean, he's now with the Bills, and I saw a lot of things on film that I did not like from him. And I think the Bengals offense is theoretically better without him being on the field. But now it comes time to, what do they do on the interior? Now it's not just, we can sit here and we can applaud the Cordy Glenn trade all we want, but it's not just the center position that now needs to be addressed. It's also the right guard position. And because so, I mentioned a couple of names before, but, what if their plan was, and Westerman at right guard, and now all of a sudden you've got a couple of positions to fill, and essentially right tackle. And that's probably going to be a battle. We talked about this last week on our show. It's probably going to be a battle between Fisher, Abuehi, maybe a rookie. So while the Bengals are set from left guard and left tackle, they have 3 positions essentially to designate this offseason. Do so, they can't sit around and let's hope this guy develops by giving him some snaps. Like, they need to get guys now who can come in and play. So obviously there are a number of different players. One guy that a lot of Bengals fans like is Billy Price. Very good on film, solid guy, stout guy, probably a guy that can anchor your offensive line. However, he is a guy now that is battling a partially torn pectoral muscle. So now that the Bengals have moved back from 12 to 21 with the trade with the Bills, I don't know if I see the value with Billy Price at 21. Nor do I see a guy potentially who could come in and start day one. Now, there is reports that reports are out there that he could be ready for summer workouts. He could be ready for training camp. That very well may be the case. But this is a team now, based on what I've said before, that wants players who can help you today. And that could be because of poor drafting in the past. It could be because of poor draft picks in their past. But they need guys now who can come in and say, I'm ready. Day one, I'm going to start for you. Kevin Zeiler was that guy. And I just think that maybe Billy Price is a good value in the second round. I wouldn't doubt that. But they need to get guys who help them now. And with that injury, I don't know that Billy Price is the answer there. I don't know that he's not the answer, but you can't reach for a guy like that. And that's my worry is, last year the Bengals, or John Ross at number 9, he was the 3rd wide receiver off the board at number 9. I like John Ross. I continue to like John Ross as a pick for this team. I just think when you take the third, essentially what is looked at as the 3rd best player, or the 3rd player off the board at your position in the first 10 picks, that's a little bit of a reach, and this team cannot afford to do that. So I don't know what that means. There are guys like Will Hernandez. There's Isaiah Wynn. There are other guards and whatnot that could potentially help the Bengals. And I think that you'll probably those names in the first 2 rounds. But I just, I think we need to kind of I don't know that center in the first round, especially with Billy Price nursing the injury that he has, I don't know that that's necessarily the answer. I could be very wrong. Billy Price could come out and be, a Nick Hardwick or what have you. But I think you need to be very sure that this is. These are picks. These are guys who will come in on day one and help your team immediately, because that's what this team needs, and that's what apparently seems to be their plan, based on contracts and all of that. So I just I think Bodine being gone is a blessing in disguise, if you will, but I don't know that means let's go reach for somebody in the draft, especially at number 21. I think the Bengals, again, in a rare situation with them, but I do think there's going to be. They have 11 picks again this year, and last year they had 11 picks, and I think 3 or 4 of them didn't end up making the final 53-man roster because of injuries or cuts or what have you. So I don't think that this is a team that needs 11 picks. I think this is quality over quantity. And I just think that this team needs guys who can, whether it's moving around or what have you, this is a team that needs guys who can come in right now. I see Christopher Higdon saying Frank Ragnow and James Daniels, obviously guys who are on that same type of level in terms of what the Bengals need and what those guys can provide, and I think that's those are viable options. It's really strange to me though, because this. Traditionally in the draft, guards and centers are not valued in terms of high round picks and all that. You've seen, Travis Frederick, guy who was picked at the late end of a first round, and Zeitler was a late first round pick. I mean, there are guys in there obviously that help, but it's just weird to me that it's still kind of a continuing trend in the draft where you just don't spend those type of high picks on guard, on center, that sort of thing. Yet, if you look at the free agency market for centers, for guards over the past, it's pretty high in terms of finances. So these are guys that are valued, and I think that it just basically tells you that you need to get guys and you need to keep them in the interior of your offensive line. And obviously, if the market with Zeitler, it just didn't make financial sense with the Bengals, but they're worse off for it. And the Bills had a glaring need at center, and they signed a starting center in Russell Bodine. We'll see how that goes, but I think that the Bengals will probably address that position and the guard position within the first 3 rounds, and they have 4 picks in those first 3 rounds. So, that doesn't mean that it's going to be round 1, round 2. It could be the 2 picks in the 3rd round. But I would not be surprised if the Bengals end up drafting a guy along with signing a potential free agent. You also have to remember that June 1st cuts are out there, and obviously, that's a thing where the Bengals really like to kind of scour that waiver wire, because those are guys that do not count against the compensatory formula. So we'll see, but Russell Bodine's gone. The Bengals need a center. It's kind of a weird thing, especially if you followed the team basically over the past couple of years, because they have gone, aside from 2011, they have gone into the draft without, we need this position. We don't have a guy to start, and that's kind of the situation with the middle to the right side of their line. I would like to think that Fisher or Boyhe, somebody would be able to hop into the right tackle spot. I would like to think that somebody like Christian Westerman could be the right guard, but I mean, regardless, they have a number of openings on that offensive line, and that's okay. That's okay because they have a new offensive line coach, and they have they've let some guys go, and they just better be sure that these guys that they potentially draft are going to be guys that can contribute right away. I'm looking at the live YouTube chat, Big Rig Bill saying Mike McGlinchey. Unfortunately, I like that guy. I don't think he's ever going to be an all-pro. I don't think he's ever going to be a Pro Bowler. I think he's going to be a solid NFL offensive lineman. I do not think that he will be available at 21. And, this is a year. I mentioned the amount of picks they had last year. And I just feel like this is a year where the Bengals can afford to be aggressive in terms of moving up, moving around, that sort of thing. Especially if it's a guy they like. And they have not traditionally done that. I think they've done that 3 times in the history of their franchise. But look what it's gotten them. 0 Super Bowls, no playoff wins since 19. You got to get guys that can help you now. You got to get quality over quantity. I don't know. That's kind of my take. One of the other things I want to address before we get out of here is the need for a running back. I have an answer to this one. I'm fence rider. You know this about me. But Jeremy Hill signed a 1-year deal with the Patriots, and good for him because I think that that's a very good landing spot for him. But the Bengals invested a second-round pick in Joe Mixon last year, and they got one in Giovanni Bernard. I just don't know. Cedric Pierman's a free agent, and they've got some kind of undrafted free agent guys behind them. Here's my thing. Joe Mixon missed a couple of games last year with an injury. Giovanni Bernard is a very valuable guy, but has missed time as well. Might we be looking at another high-ish pick at running back? Now, I'm not saying some of the big names that you see out there, but maybe somebody in the 3rd round falls to them, especially with that compensatory pick. Maybe it's a Ronald Jones of USC. Maybe it's somebody else. I don't know. But maybe it's like, hey, this is a guy who can help us today, but it's also helping bolster the offense and bolstering guys who we can't count on. And I don't know if that's in the plans. My thought is, in terms of needs, it's probably down the pecking order. I think interior, offensive line, center, guard, defensive tackle, linebacker, all of those take precedence over a running back. What if you get an explosive guy that falls to you in the middle rounds and you kind of say, well, we've taken care of center, guard, defensive tackle in the first few picks. Now we've got this running back. I don't know. This comes back to how many snaps are these guys going to get, and how is this person going to help you now? And I think Jeremy Hill, while most of us pretty much thought it was a foregone conclusion that he was going to be gone, I think we need to kind of maybe revisit the discussion of do the Bengals need a running back? And I like very versatile. I like Giovanni's Bernard's skill set, very versatile. But you need guys who are there. You need guys who are available, and those guys have not proven to be such so far in their respective NFL careers. Now, is that fair? Probably not. I mean, Joe Mixon's only been in the league a year, but if you are, there are basically this team needs to run the ball better. They need to protect the passer better, and they need to stop the run better. That's basically the glaring needs from last year. And, if you kind of take care of the latter two issues you see in the draft, I don't know. I mean, why not a running back? And there are so many sides of this coin, because you can sit here and you say, well, the reason why none of these guys have been able to shine as a running back is because there's been too many splitting of carries, because they've had so many talented or high draft picks at running back over the first few years. Totally, I get it. But at some point, this team needs to be able to run the ball effectively. This team needs to be able to take a little bit of pressure off of Andy Dalton. And I think that a move like Cordy Glenn, potentially a move for Price, Wynn, Ragnow, whoever Daniels, whoever it may be in the draft, will probably point to what the Bengals want to do on offense. They hired a new offensive line coach for a reason, and it's because, aside from being able to protect Andy Dalton, it's because they want to run the ball more effectively, and they have not been able to do that. So I think that we may see a running back in play over the maybe day 2, probably day 3, but do not be surprised if a running back is in there in terms of their relatively high picks that they have based on Jeremy Hill leaving and what this offense needs. We'll see. I see Terrell Howell says O-line, linebacker, safety, edge rushers are all above running back. Totally, I get it. And you cannot win in the end. It's so funny because we've talked about how the NFL is a passing league, and you got to have multiple receivers and a viable quarterback and a good offensive line, but you got to be able to get to the quarterback. You got to be able to tackle. And believe it or not, you got to be able to run the football. And all of those spots that he mentioned were obviously above running back, but I wouldn't be surprised if running back is in their priority list going forward, even though they have Joe Mixon and Giovanni Bernard going forward. This is the Orange and Black Insider Bengals podcast. I'm Anthony Cosenza. I appreciate all of you tuning in live. And if you are not tuning in live, where are you? Come on, join us. It's fun. A lot of people talking in the YouTube chat, and I try and bring in your questions and comments on the air when I can. But if you are not joining us live, you can get the show on iTunes and SoundCloud. You can also get in touch with the program at Bengals OBI and the obinsider@gmail.com via email. Thanks so much for tuning in this week. I know it's been a solo show, but I've tried to carry my own, and I appreciate all of you tuning in, and I appreciate that are now a bit reinvested in the Cincinnati Bengals now that they've done some stuff in the free agency period, and we're not sold on them yet, but I think feelings at this point in 2018 are much more positive than they were at this point in 2017, and even at this point in 2016. The Bengals are making moves and improving their team, and I think the draft will potentially get us more excited. Now, does that mean they're going to be a playoff team? That's yet to be decided, but we'll see. Thanks for tuning in. Again, I'm Anthony Cosenza. Get all our stuff on a number of different mediums. Join us live. Appreciate it, and we'll talk to you soon.